We're finishing up with chapter 7, moving into chapter 8. And so here are some things that I thought would be of interest. So first of all, finishing up the little chapter. That doesn't look very good, does it? There we go. Following up on the chapter, the section dealing with with Hermes, there was mention of this event that happened in 415 BCE, the mutilation of the Herms. Now, the Herms, you may remember, they were these basically sort of stone blocks on top of which there was carved a head, usually a bearded head, and in the front there was a male member that was erect. In 415, someone went through the agora, the Athenian marketplace, and mutilated the Herms that were there. So they like messed up the face, but they also knocked off the male member. And this made a big scandal. Now the reason this is important is because Athens in 415 was in the middle of what's known as the Peloponnesian War. This is a war against Sparta, which is in the Peloponnese, hence the term the Peloponnesian War. Athens was likely to win the war with the help of this young general named Alcibiades. So his name's there at the bottom. Now Alcibiades had a reputation of being sort of a wild, crazy guy. The likelihood is that he did do a lot of crazy things, and I tend to think of him as being somewhat like Bill Clinton. His reputation as a Democratic politician is that he engages in wild behavior. At any rate, he had a plan to go to Sicily and attack Syracuse, which was allied with Sparta, and Sicily could provide all sorts of food to Sparta. So this was an important objective. So the likelihood is, had Alcibiades led the Athenian forces at Syracuse, that the Athenians would have won. Syracuse, the defeat of Syracuse would have cut off a food supply, necessary food supply for Sparta, and that would, of course, helped Athens win the war, probably. Probably would have been a quick end to the war, maybe another 3 or 4 years, and the war would have been over. Athens would have been the winner. But because Alcibiades was accused of having done this, or at least suspected of having done this, he was too powerful for the people to attack him directly, so he set sail with the Athenian fleet. After he set sail, they made the accusation. Word got to Alcibiades that he had been accused, and he then, with his own ship, took off for the Spartan side at Syracuse and gave them help. So the Spartans won the Battle of Syracuse, and even though the war continued for another 10 years, this was really sort of the big blow to Athens, to their chance of winning. And it was all because of this incident that happened, which Alcibiades may or may not have been involved in, but he certainly would have probably been put on trial for it and probably found guilty. So he's probably right for suspecting that. And here's just a picture of a lekithos, which is a small jug that you'd have oil in, showing a side view of a Herm. So you can see it's just a block. It's got a head on top, and then it's got an erect. And so you can imagine, the way these were mutilated, probably with stones and so forth. The face was messed up, and the equipment was knocked off. All right, so the scholarship in chapter 7 deals with, so in chapter 6 we were looking at structuralism and how structuralism works. In chapter 7 we're looking at archetypes, which is another way of looking at things. It's sort of from a psychological point of view. Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychoanalyst, came up with this idea of archetypes, that basically our brain was sort of wired to know certain types. So you have like the wise old man. You've got usually the the young hero in training. You've got the damsel in distress. You've got the trickster figure is also an archetypal figure. So, so this chapter deals with that, and there are a couple things that are worth looking at in this section dealing with the scholarship. One is Doty and Hines, William Doty and William Hines. They wrote a book on tricksters where they looked at a bunch of tricksters in different mythologies, and they found 5 characteristics that tended to be typical of tricksters. One was that the trickster spurns. Okay, so the key things out of that, I'm not going to go through the 5. You can find the 5 in the book, but tricksters tend to spurn convention. So in other words, what people normally do, tricksters don't necessarily do, and they often spurn convention and sometimes make fun of it. They also tend to do their own thing. And you can see that certainly in the case of Hermes, right? Hermes is a baby, but he doesn't act like a baby. Hermes tells lies a lot of times. Hermes does all sorts of things. So he's doing his own thing. He's not listening to what others are saying about him. And the trickster can be a hero or a problem. So in Greek myth, the trickster is often a heroic figure. So Prometheus is a trickster figure, and his tricks generally work out well for humans. Likewise, Hermes is a trickster figure who tends to be something of a culture hero. But in Norse myth, for instance, the main trickster figure is Loki, and Loki actually tends to cause more trouble. He does great things for the gods because he's very clever, but his cleverness tends to undermine the gods. So things don't turn out so well with Hermes on board. The comparison section deals with the figure of Thoth, who is an Egyptian deity, and this is generally how Thoth looks. Sometimes he looks like a baboon, but usually he looks like a man with an ibis head. The bird head that is on top is an ibis. And he is pretty much every Greek would have associated the Egyptian god Thoth with the Greek god Hermes. Here, the picture shows Mercury. Both are associated with literacy, with learning, with language, with the dead. Hermes takes the dead to the underworld. Thoth is often part of the panel that judges the dead. So there are definite similarities between the two. And the Greek names for the temples of Thoth in Egypt, they generally refer to them as temples of Hermes. So the guy in the middle is Hermes Trismegistus. So Hermes Trismegistus may have been an actual person. Who he was sort of a mage, sort of a magus figure, a magician, a clever person, and the name means Hermes thrice great, and he gets qualities because he's from Africa. He gets qualities of Thoth. He also gets qualities from Hermes. The name, of course, suggests Hermes, and you'll notice that he's a bearded man here, like wrapped up in sort of in a cloak. Sometimes you'll see artwork that shows Mercury or Hermes, and he is bearded and he's old, which is unlike Hermes, who is generally beardless and young, as the statue of Mercury here shows. So if you ever see that in art, it's because Hermes and Hermes Trismegistus get sort of confused with one another, even though they were really separate figures. The KnockLaben section deals with the figure of Hermaphroditus, that figure in the Victorian era, in the period known as the pre-Raphaelite period, which is like the 1880s, 1890s. So it's the end of the 19th century, at the height of the Victorian period. Apparently, the many of the literary people in Victorian England were gaga over the figure of Hermaphroditus. So it does suggest that there was some sort of interest in Victorian England was very staid, very proper, right? It's all about doing things, according to the way you're supposed to do them. And so this interest in gender fluidity is, I just find interesting. And you'll see stuff about that in the chapter. The story about Hermaphroditus is as follows. So he's the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, hence the name Hermaphroditus. And he is very handsome, as one would expect, being the child of these two gods. And then a nymph named Salmachus, who is the nymph of a hot water spring, falls in love with him. And one day, Hermaphroditus goes into the warm spring to bathe or something, just to relax. And Salmachus winds herself around him, and they basically merge, right? He sort of melts into her, and they become one. And so you've got then Hermaphroditus, who has both male and female physicality as a result. Aside from the story, though, Hermes is associated with the in-between space, right? Most of the gods are like this side or that side, but Hermes tends to be in the middle, going to this side or that side as he feels up to it. And so the two kids associated with him are Hermaphroditus, who becomes then a hermaphrodite with both genders, so he's in between male and female, right? And Pan, who is a god that looks like a goat, has goat-like legs, has a tail, and has a goat's head, but otherwise looks human, and is always has an erection, so he's always sexually aroused. Now, Pan, all the other gods freak out when they see Pan, but Hermes is a proud papa, and he shows them all off in the Homeric hymn to Pan. So, it makes some sense that Hermes would be the father of both Hermaphroditus and Pan, two figures who are really sort of like out there. They're sort of weird by the sort of norm that might be in play. Now, chapter 8 deals with Apollo and Artemis, and here it mainly gives stuff about Apollo, but we do get more about Artemis than we do most of the chapters that have the two gods. One god gets like all the attention, the other gets very little. Here they get close to equal amount. Artemis is a goddess associated with young women and nature, and she is she's not associated with marriage, she's not associated with married life or that sort of thing, but with young girls up to the point where they become marriageable. Because once they become marriageable, they're looking to Hera and they're looking to Aphrodite as their goddesses, and giving up Artemis as the god who looks after them. So, and then Apollo, of course, is the god of male excellence, of sports, of education, of poetry, of music. He's got a bunch of different things. So I did want to talk about the festivals that are mentioned. So the festival Artemis Brauronia is a festival in Athens. This festival, girls would go to this festival, and it was served as a puberty rite for them. So when they hit puberty or soon after, they would take place in this festival, and it was basically sort of a goodbye to Artemis. That was the sort of deal. Now, the story, I think, that is behind the festival is the story of a woman named Callisto. So Callisto was a nymph, part of Artemis's group. Zeus wanted to have sex with Artemis, with Callisto. He disguised himself as Artemis, so he disguised himself as his own daughter, so that he could first cuddle with Callisto. Then he actually attacks her, rapes her. As soon as Callisto realizes this isn't Artemis, but it's actually a male, she freaks out, tries to get away, is unable to do so. She is then turned into a bear by Hera, who blames Callisto for what her husband did. And then, well, she turned into a bear eventually. Before that happens, as soon as Artemis realizes she's pregnant, she's kicked out of the Artemis's club because she's now pregnant. And then she's turned into a bear. Well, she gives birth to a son, a human son, and that human son grows up and becomes a hunter and is about to kill his mom when Zeus intervenes and makes them both constellations, and they become Arcturus, the bear warden, or the Little Dipper, Ursa Minor, and then Ursa Major, the big bear, which is supposed to be Callisto. The reason that story is important to Artemis Brauronia is at the festival of Artemis Brauronia, the girls would dress up in some way like bears, and they would dance the bear dance. I mean, we don't know exactly what that was, but my guess is the whole point of that thing in connection with Callisto is the girls are accepting that their bodies are changing. They're soon going to be married. Once they're married, they can't hang around with Artemis anymore. They're no longer nature children. They're now going to be married women. Okay, so that seems to be the connection. The Artemis Orthia ritual or festival took place in Sparta. And here, this was a coming-of-age ritual for Spartan boys. So Spartan boys, for some time before the festival, would wear masks and do other things that sort of dehumanize them, and they would be treated badly. Then they would go through this festival, and one of the parts of the festival was that they would stand by the altar of Artemis Orthia and they'd be whipped. And then what they were supposed to do was start laughing and acting as if the whipping didn't bother them at all, to show that they were tough and therefore true Spartans. And then once that ritual was over, they were then welcomed as adult members of the Spartan citizenry. The Hyacinthia is a festival in honor of Apollo, and it's for young men. It also took place in Sparta. Hyacinthus was a Spartan youth that Apollo loved. I don't know whether we were in like sexual relation or not, these guys, or they were just sort of friends. But Hyacinth one day was playing with Apollo. They apparently were shooting the discus back and forth, and Apollo's throw took a weird bounce, and it hit Hyacinthus in the face, and then his blood came down, and where the blood dripped on the ground, up came the hyacinth flower, which is like a purplish flower, and the boy died, and so the festival was then decreed in his honor. It's in Sparta, and so in the Hyacinthia festival, the young men are sort of honoring Hyacinth, the memory of Hyacinthus, who died in this weird discus accident. And by the way, there are other myths that have weird discus accidents. I mean, it just, you can see why in the modern Olympics, the discus, where the guys throw the discus from, is actually surrounded by a net. So if there is a wild throw, it does not go into the stands and actually bonk someone in the head. So that's it for this. If you've got any questions, you feel free to get in touch with me about it. But otherwise, just make your posts on the discussion board.